Hi there, and thanks so much for joining us. Today, a different introduction, given that the changes that occurred in the New Zealand media landscape took place after our interview with Craig Norenbergs. So I recorded this interview with Craig in mid-March 2023. Today FM, which Craig talks about with me, and we reflect upon both generally and quite specifically in relation to the media in New Zealand and his work, went to air for the last time on the 30th of March 2023. It was Craig's blessing. We've left the interview as is. It's a great reflection on his perspectives of the media in New Zealand, and indeed mine, as someone who is interested in media both here in Australia and New Zealand, and in fact, in many other places. So a shout out to everyone, no matter where you are, in no matter what industry you are working in that is going through significant change, and a particular shout out to the people on Today FM whose radio station ceased going to air in quite dramatic circumstances, it would be fair to say, on the 30th of March 2023. This episode now with Craig Norenbergs here on Dear 21-Year-Old Me. Hello, and thanks so much for joining us. Today on the show, we catch up with Craig Norenbergs, journalist and manager. Now, Australians will know Craig from his time at the ABC and Sky News. New Zealanders will know Craig from his time with Sky TV and on commercial TV and radio. Craig's had a fascinating career from his days in regional TV in Canberra, working in London, Doha, and now New Zealand, including heading up the ABC's iconic Grandstand program, for example. But before we meet Craig, let's go back into 1989, the year 1989, to find out what was happening when he was turning 21. In Australia, interest rates on home mortgages reached 17%. Can you imagine that? 17%. Bob Hawke is PM. Labor in Queensland comes to power for the first time since, get this, 1957, those were the Joe years, while the first elections are held for the Australian Capital Territory, Canberra. Young Talentine said, "Good night, Australia." It's cancelled after having been on air since 1971. Meanwhile, the introduction of aggregation, where regional TV audiences go from having one commercial TV station in the area to up to three, comes to Canberra and southern New South Wales, and we'll hear more of that with Craig. In sport, Australia regains the Ashes on English soil for the first time in 40 years, defeating England 4-0 in the 6-Test Ashes series. I remember that vividly, sleeping very little, except sometimes in English class with Mr. Biggins. Sorry about that, but listening to the ABC and BBC coverage, the Canberra Raiders defeat the Balmain Tigers 19-14 in extra time. And in the Super Bowl, the San Francisco 49ers win 20-16 over the Cincinnati Bengals. In the US, George H.W. Bush, that was the dad, is sworn in as president, while the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska's Prince William Sound sees 240,000 barrels of oil released after the ship runs aground. And in the US, The Simpsons. Remember? Simpsons. Good old Bart Laser on the saxophone. Simpsons premieres on Fox. In New Zealand, TV3 begins broadcasting and Sunday trading commences. Australians were listening to Madonna's Like a Prayer, The Pretenders' I'm Going to Be 500 Miles, and one that I love to sing much to my son's horror, Sorry Gus, in the car. Did it the other day, and he was mortified. Ian Moss's iconic, well, it was pretty good, Tucker's Daughter. It's 1989. It's the year when our guest Craig Norenbergs turned 21. Craig, welcome. You heard the introduction when we stepped back into 1989, which was the year that you turned 21. What do you remember about that year?
A young man with dreams, going back to 1989. No, actually, I think I was at ANU, the Australian National University in Canberra. I was just trying to survive through uni and make it through, and that was my dream, was to get the degree. But I was still, in 1989, I had a great job working for Swain's Stationers in Canberra, who I don't think they exist anymore. They're a big stationery company, and I used to drive the truck. I was a delivery guy. That was my holiday job. Still the best job I ever had. I'd have the radio on and drive around and from shop to shop and doing that. And I was working weekends at Triple S FM, which doesn't exist anymore, which was the TAB racing station in Canberra. I worked on a show called Backpage Sunday.
In Canberra, that's right.
And with a wonderful manager who I've got to call out to him. Jim Patterson was his name, who really gave me my first break. He was a family friend and had said, come in on the weekends and do this. And one of the guys who worked on it was Gavin Morris, who ended up being the head of news at the ABC, also worked on that show. And another guy, Richard Stevenson, who had worked in radio but now works in public service in Canberra. So a lot of good people. Chris Coleman, who calls Raiders games and has a storied radio career as well. He worked at Triple S. So there are a lot of well-known names that came through then there. And ANU was a great uni. Great uni to be at, and it was a good time riding my bike everywhere. Canberra had a great, bike system. So 89, and I think I had my first serious girlfriend. So it was broken hearts and big dreams, and the Raiders won the grand final, of course. So that was the hype.
You would have been very happy.
Yeah, very.
People can't see us, but behind Craig's shoulder is a Canberra Raiders, I don't know, a digital clock or something, probably from the time of
digital clock,
Canberra milk ads. So
yes, and I've got lots of little figurines from the era and jerseys.
That's excellent. Because you grew up in the inner north of Canberra, so it wouldn't have been hard to get to uni. I guess you didn't have to go far from the inner north of Canberra to the
it was easy
central part of Canberra.
Yeah. So born in Queanbeyan. Grew up in the inner north, and I just used to go it was downhill most of the way to uni. Riding back was a bit hilly, but I wonder how fit are you when you're young? I'd riding my bike everywhere, playing footy, going to the gym every morning, just go, going for a run all the time, and things I can't do now. It's the folly of youth. You don't appreciate it when you've got it, and you miss it when it's gone.
Until it's gone, that's right. What was your 21st birthday celebration like? Both of us having lived in Canberra, I suspect I'm going to hear some places that I remember and kind of shudder at. No disrespect.
Yeah, I didn't. I'd been to plenty of 21st of my friends of that era that upstairs at Mooseheads and the Private Bin and Pandora's and
yes,
was it the Pacific Club in Civic and then those kind of clubs. But my 21st, unfortunately, fell during exams, so I didn't have a big 21st. We had a lot of family and friends from Queanbeyan and interstate came for. I think I had a midweek. It was like a Thursday night, and it was pretty subdued. So I didn't actually have a really big one. I made up for it with big 25th and 40th and 50th and that kind of thing. But my 21st, sad to report, was pretty quiet. My father, who's Latvian, did give me the Latvian ring, which is a ring that they give the male Latvians when they turn 21. So that was the highlight.
And we're going to talk a bit about Dad later, because Dad's story in his own right and Dad's family story is something that when I did some research about you, I went, oh, hang on, this is really interesting. Growing up in Canberra, so we got 80, so hang on, you're 21, so it's late 80s, mid-late 80s.
Good time.
Good time in Canberra. It hadn't.
Good time to be alive.
Well, indeed. I hadn't seen a tram yet. What did you want to go out and do? Sorry, that's a bit of a Canberra joke.
I get it.
Yeah, you do. Just for people who don't understand, the main what's called the main road, Northbourne Avenue.
Northbourne Avenue,
tram line, as opposed to having taken all those lovely old trees down. So, it's changed a lot, I suspect, since you and I were there. What did you want to go out and do? I was back at Christmas. What was life like living in Lyneham?
Mm-hmm. Great. Great. Big backyard, lots of, cricket and footy fields and riding my bike everywhere. And I went to Lyneham High and Lyneham Primary. So I went to local schools and then local universities. So, life in Canberra, at least for us, middle class. Mum was the canteen manageress at Lyneham Primary. Dad was an insurance salesman. So it was pretty, I wouldn't say we were well off at all, but we were kind of middle class. But I always wanted to be a journalist. Did you have
a career? Sorry.
Yeah, which I think was the next question.
Great.
Yeah. I always wanted to be, or something a bit like something in writing or voice or something like that. And then, but then radio was the big. I wanted to work in radio. But strangely, my career took me more towards television before I came back to radio. But my big first love was radio. Dad listened to a lot of music, and there were always LPs spread out, and he'd have parties, and there'd be ashtrays full of ash and all these LP records. Or I'd get up in the morning and Dad would be smoking and painting something or putting wallpaper up, listening to Hot August Night or Kingston Trio is big into kind of folk, or Glenn Campbell or the Best of the Monkeys, that kind of, or some early rock and roll with Elvis and the Everly Brothers. So great family to grow up in, and that through that love of music, and we're always listening to radio, but I always used to listen to the news and sport. Obviously I'd listen to, because back in those days, it's hard for people to imagine a time before every game being shown on Fox or Sky. Back then there was the ABC had the Saturday game, right. Then one of the either 7 or 10 had the big game, which was edited highlights of whatever the Sunday game was in Sydney, and the rest of it you listen to on radio. And then listening to that, I was inspired and thought, well, I want to work in radio one day. And I guess I did, but it just took me a while to get there.
So we got a degree in history and sociology from the ANU, and then you went to the University of Canberra and did a postgrad degree in professional broadcasting. So was that the plan?
Yeah, I went back to uni. I'd finished my ANU degree, and I went and worked in the Whitsundays on South Mole Island, which actually it wasn't as much fun as it sounds. Beautiful island, beautiful place, but oh my gosh, it was hard work. And I'd actually met a girl there and followed her to Sydney, and she dumped me on the first day I got there, which wasn't much. But while I was there, I did a broadcasting course at the Max Rowley Media Academy. And so did that, and I'd do that. I think it was a Tuesday night, and while I was doing that, I was working at a place called City Extra at Circular Quay, which is kind of like where they wear news shirts with newspapers on them. And so that was I was doing overnights, and that made it tough. But after I'd finished the Max Rowley course, I got in my Kingswood and I drove and visited every radio station in ACT, New South Wales and South Australia. And nobody gave me a job. I had my little cassette tape in those days, the dozens of them that I would take, and I'd ring them 2 days ahead and say, "Look, I'm coming to Dubbo in 2 days. Is it okay if I meet you just for 5 minutes?" So I'd meet these kind of older, back in those days, because radio was still a real big thing in country stations, and I had jeans and a shirt and a tie, and they would either say, "Oh, the fact that you've got jeans on means you don't take this seriously," or they would say, "The fact you've got a tie on means you're too serious for us." So I couldn't win. I'm like, so no one gave me a job. I remember driving to Broken Hill, and the guy forgot. Broken Hill is like Mars. It was Broken Hill where they filmed Mad Max, and I got there, and he'd forgotten that he was meeting me. He was off playing golf, and so that was heartbreaking. So as a result of that, I started doing a voice course in Canberra, and at one stage I was the New South Wales Voices Stedford speech champion, and because we enter all these competitions. So through that, the woman that was doing my voice training said, "Why don't you go to uni? So I did postgrad at University of Canberra, which great uni, great friends, and then from that, and this is the interesting story how I broke into media. At the conclusion of my postgrad at Uni of Canberra, I contacted Capital Television, 10 Capital, and because CDC was when I was growing up, CTC, Canberra only had CDC and ABC. So Capital was quite prestigious, big newsroom, and I reached out to the news director, whose name I can't remember, who knocked me back. And I just wanted to do work experience. No. So I rang him and said, "Look, I want to work in news, but how do I know if this is what I'm meant to be doing if you don't give me the opportunity to see?" And he said, "That's a fair argument. All right." So I did work experience there and in news, and then while I was there, I was playing rugby league, and I went to tackle a guy, and he swung around with his elbow, and he knocked this cheekbone into my eye, sliced the corner of my eye out. So I went off to, and so I had all this. They did all the operations up here. At one point, they were going to remove my eye, but as a result of this, I wrote a letter to Capital Television thanking them. Thank you very much for the opportunity, but my face is busted, and so then they rang and said, "Oh, we didn't know you were into sport. We got a job going in sport. Do you want the job?" And that's how I broke into television, because of literally a lucky break, and never looked back on it. Yeah, well.
Pun intended. 2 puns in one sentence. Michael Rowland rang. He wants his material back. No, that's great.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's free. So did you want to go into news? Or did you want to be a hard news guy on CTC?
I wanted to be a news guy. And I remember a teacher at Lynham Primary saying to the class what journalists do and what like a foreign correspondent would do. And I remember sitting there distinctly thinking, there's no way that me and Lynham would ever have a job like that. That's like a serious job. And I remember thinking as a kid, how am I going to get from here to there? And so I'd worked in sport at Capital, and my first day, which was a Saturday, my mum bought me a new suit. I bought a tie and I wore it in, not knowing that most newsrooms, you don't wear a suit on the weekends. You just wear this. And so the newsroom laughed at me like, hey, look at this idiot. Look at him, dressed up like a pelican. And I remember standing there kind of this humiliated, okay, I get it. This is how it's going to be. All right, you're not my friends. I'm just going to be working with you guys. And I made lots of friends there, but that was my first day in television, was them taking the piss out of me.
Wow.
But I had great experience at Capital.
We don't have egos in TV at all.
No, not at all. But I learned my early lesson at Capital, and they were very patient. And Peter Chapman, who was my boss, was absolutely fantastic, and he gave me some great opportunities, and I got to work. And back then, that was a fully functioning 1 hour news on the newsroom was awesome. And Dan Craig, who was the political reporter he was having a cigarette out back, and he had his Parliament lanyard around, because they'd always be sitting out back. I think they'd started it. You couldn't smoke indoors, but you could smoke most of it. And there were still typewriters at work. And he said, how you finding? He spoke like this. How are you finding it? And I said, it's really good, He goes, and he said, one day you'll move on from here. And at the point, I could tell you how much I was on, $17,500 a year, and I would have paid them. And I never thought I'd leave Capital Television. And he said, you know what? By the end of your career, I reckon you're going to work at about a dozen places. And he was right. At the time, I thought, why would I ever leave this job? I love this job. And probably a bit like him. Most people in media, their careers, you have to go where the work is, and as long as you keep working, because the vicissitudes of life will take you, as it happened at Capital, when finally they there was aggregation had come in, and Southern Cross, and they brought in Prime and Win. So it was like effectively every other capital city. They had suddenly all these, had 3 commercials and the ABC and SBS. And the Southern Cross, we knew it was happening. They were having discussions about, redundancies and, what can we do? And they got rid of the weekend news. They were just going to take from Sydney. So they sacked half the newsroom, and this is how they did it. And you would never do this these days, and you wouldn't get away with it. I think I'd been playing golf and got called in, and they got us all in an edit suite, and they just went, it's you and you and you. And that was how we all found out, like in front of everyone. It wasn't like you were taken, and we were like,
wow.
Okay. And that was finished. And so my $17,500.
Thanks very much for your service.
Yeah, that was it. And I'm pretty sure the ones that survived thought, oh, this is great, we survived. But then eventually, Capital doesn't exist anymore. And media is a tough game like that. And it was hard. It's been hard convincing my in-laws and my parents that this is media. It's not me. It's them. They're breaking up with me, but it's just the way that, because the accountants own media, and you're just a dot on their spreadsheet, and they'll go, get rid of that one, get rid of. And I was the youngest, so they would have gone, we'll get rid of the youngest and the oldest and a couple in between. And that was the sad way. And media still runs like that, but although they don't say to people it's you and you these days, you take them into a room and have a chat and help them through it.
Far out, but the outcome is still the same. It's a very brutal industry, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, it's horrendous, and some of the fun's gone out of it because it is accountants sitting around. And my theory is the people in the accounts department. There is no way that there's someone sitting in the accounts department with all my experience who isn't paid well.
No,
they would say I'm the senior accountant and I should be paid this. But unfortunately, in an industry that is a bit creative and esoteric about what the role do, the accountant would say, well, it doesn't matter Craig's experience. We'll just get someone else to do that job as long as the job's being done. What does it matter? Yeah. So they will easily, and this is what makes it tough. When I remember when I was at Sky News, a guy called Ian Cook, who was a legend. He'd been the news director at Channel 9 and he'd set up Sky News in England and he'd been news director at 7. He was an industry legend. But Ian, who's now sadly gone, a very, very good man. He had a second wife, so he had to keep working to pay the bills and the kids and whatever. So when he walked into Sky News, I remember one of the producers saying, "Wow, Ian Cook, survivor." And if you're past 50, I could describe myself as a survivor now. You end up becoming a survivor because it's such a tough industry that it is really dog eat dog, and it's hard to explain. Certainly, it's very hard. It was hard to explain to my in-laws how tough it was, and just the daily grind of hanging on to your job, and unfortunately, I was saying to a young bloke who left MediaWorks Today FM, where I work at the moment, went into television. And because MediaWorks, where I work now, it's the most beautiful culture and the people are fantastic. And he was going to television. And I'd said, now be careful, because when you're in television newsroom, you're not only competing with Channel 7 or Channel 9, you're competing with other people in the newsroom as well. So effectively, you're nervous all the time. Like I was reading an article on Barbara Walters that you couldn't say at a dinner party to Barbara Walters, I've got Martina Navratilova lined up for an exclusive next week, because Barbara Walters, and that's actually happened, rang up Martina Navratilova and said, give it to me. Give me the exclusive. This is someone she worked with and was a friend. So it's the kind of industry where you just got to cut your own swathe, and you'll have the good guys will figure themselves out. And I've made lots of friends in my career, but at the same time, super competitive and stressful, and everyone has. You've got to pay tribute to people that can spend, like the Ian Cooks of this world that had long careers like that. And Cookie I learned one wonderful thing from Cookie. He used to get cranky at you, and then you change it, right? Because you'd done something. I remember putting like a cricket score or having an argument on a cricket graphic with him over how many bowlers do you put up, how many batsmen on, how much statistics do you need to have on the score when it comes up?
Oh, on the super.
On the super, right? Yep. Yeah. So he wanted three batsmen, 3 bowlers, and I started the argument. I don't know. It's only up for a second. I don't know how much info. And then he was I could see he's angry. No, but I'll change it for you, Cookie. No worries, I'll change it. And then a lot of bosses I've worked with will hold that against you. So somewhere 2 months later, they'll say, "Oh, like the time you put 3 graphics on," and use it as some kind of argument. Cookie wouldn't do that. If he had a go at you, gone. And it was a true tribute to him and a testament, because that doesn't happen very often. Totally professional, that he knew when he was at work, he was at work. And then I used to have lunches, and there was never a time that I didn't sit with Cookie and think how lucky I was to be sitting with this guy. A lot of the youngies coming through didn't know who he was, but he was a legend. But that was one of the things I learned from him, was just forget about it, move on.
Just let it be. The corollary question to that is, how do you keep a sense of self? I've never met in person. This is the first time we've had a chat. But from the sense of watching you on Sky, for example, and then, your work on the ABC over the years here, I've always got the impression from you that, you're a good, in inverted commas, a good bloke. And it's been interesting having a chat to you about similar experiences in Canberra at different times, and people that we both know throughout the different broader media world. How do you keep a sense of your own self in that kind of frontline on steroids kind of environment?
Yeah, it's I think initially I was shocked by the industry.
Right.
And if you watch like a movie like Network, if you've ever seen Network, great film, 70s classic. And it's that American network style and everybody's at each other's throats that you think, oh, that's only in the movies, but it's not, because it's a super creative. If I had to drive around and couldn't get a job, that's
right.
How competitive. And I know when I was at the ABC, people would apply, if you advertise the job, you would get hundreds of people apply for a commentary job for Melbourne, or because those jobs just don't come up at the ABC. Right. But one thing I did do is everyone who we interviewed, and even some we didn't interview, I would ring them and I'd have a chat with them about why they didn't get the job. And even there were some kids that would I thought had potential. I would just ring them out of the blue.
Oh, good on you.
And we'd certainly, and I know going through this that I've applied for jobs, my wife certainly, that these days people don't get back to you. They just don't. Even if you've had an interview, they don't get back. And it becomes a big bugbear of mine that why? Because you've got to,
isn't it?
Yeah, but if you interview someone, I don't understand why you wouldn't ring them. What was the question again?
My question is, how do you keep a how do you keep a sense of self? Because you're a guy from, middle class, without being rude, middle class Canberra. You've gone down the road to ANU. I mean, it's a quick, and we both have lived in Canberra, so I'm not having a go at Canberra at all. It is the quintessential boy from Queanbeyan.
Yes.
Going to Lyneham High, Dixon College, wherever, Eddie, Darramallen, doesn't really matter. You've gone away and I love the fact that, you went up north and, it's if day one in Sydney, welcome to Heartbreak High kind of thing. How have you kept a sense of self over these years? Because you've had some really tough jobs.
Yeah. A lot of the hardest thing is, because I'm considered a good bloke, when I've been manager or boss of people, there are times when you're still the good bloke, but you've got to make tough decisions. And the minute that you sit someone down and you've got to go, mate, I didn't like what but I thought you were a good bloke. Like, it becomes a reaction to them where, and it's like they feel disappointed in me that I'm not, mate, you're right. Just, so I think that's been the hardest battle. And I think that, experience does count. So I think now I would be a better manager now than when I was younger. Unfortunately, the industry now is set that they would rather find a more cost-effective 30-year-old that they think, well, he'll just learn on the job, than to hire anyone 50 plus who has a bit of mileage under the belt and has the experience of. But I've never. I remember when the first day I started Channel 9 after I'd got flicked from the Capital, and then someone had suggested me, and then the classic story is with Paul Fenn, who was the news director there. I was hungover from our farewell do, and I can remember my sister, and I'd crashed in my parents' face. My sister came in and said, there's a Paul Fenn. It was probably 9 o'clock. There's a Paul Fenn from Channel 9 on the phone. And so I pick him, I'm like, hello. And he's like, I think he actually said, mate, sound a bit crook. What's going on? A few drinks. And I said, good on you, mate. And he said, look, listen, someone's tipped you in, and we got a job going on the Today Show in the Today Show News. And this was the interview. Do you like footy?
Right.
Yeah. Which one? I said, League and Union. Good. What do you play? I said, I play Union. You want to play for Manly? Yep. See you Monday. That was the job interview at Channel 9, which at that point was Channel 9, was number one.
Yeah.
Kerry Packer, and then
the whole thing.
I loaded up the Kingswood, started work on the Monday, and I was sitting with, and I remember I'm in the newsroom, and Tracy Grimshaw had done the Daybreak show. Lovely Tracy. Who's recently retired, and then all the Today Show people flowed in. Who I was like Steve Liebman and Ian Ross, who was the main newsreader then. Roscoe sat right there in front of me. Ian Ross, and then the first thing he introduced himself. He said, "Do you play tennis?" I said, "Yeah, I love tennis." Oh, okay. Well, we have a hit on Tuesdays. Do you want to come have a hit with us? And there was Peter Overton and like all these people would play tennis, and he was so friendly and he's now dead, poor old Roscoe.
Yeah.
But just the nicest, they were actually quite welcoming.
Right.
And so you work on the Today Show, and a great young crew. And the hours were horrendous. I'd start work at 11 p.m. and you'd do that, but great crew on the Today. And then every couple of weeks you'd work on the 6 p.m. news, which was terrifying.
Right.
Like you'd walk through the gates thinking, what's going to happen? Because there'd be 4 producers or executive producers who'd sit around and they would just pick apart your work. You probably have to write 2 things during the day, but they would and they would pick it apart out loud. And I used to print off scripts and take them home just to try and stay a step. How are these people? How are they writing? So I could mimic their style and improve my writing. It was terrifying, really scary. But that was when Brian Henderson was reading the news. The classic story with Michael Usher, who's now works at Channel 7.
Yeah, and he's doing 6 p.m. on like news on 7.
Yeah. And Usher was great. And back then he was one of the boys. He was one of, he'd hang out with us. And Brian Henderson walked up to Michael Usher one day and said, this was after the news.
Right.
Amateur. And he's looking at him, he figures out, because Michael Usher had said amateur on air, and Hendo came up to amateur and said, and that's the way, but it sounded like he was calling him an amateur.
Oh, right.
And then saying you wouldn't, if Hendo was reading the news, you wouldn't go anywhere in his, because he was didn't want any distractions. So everyone had to sit there quietly while the 6 p.m. news would go to air. And then every couple of weeks you'd have to write news breaks for Hendo. He didn't like computers, so someone would have to type it out and you'd have to take it in, and he had a butcher's pen and he would go through it and never really asked me who I was or where I was going. I was just doing the news breaks for him, and then you'd work on Nightline with Jim Whaley, and then because then I ended up working with Jim at Sky News when he went to Sky, and we became really friendly. And Jim was a great bloke, but back then he was Jim Whaley. Like to work at Channel 9 back then,
the Jim Whaley,
with Jim Whaley. Kerry Packer. My only encounter with Kerry Packer, the World Cup was it 95 or 96, the one that Sri Lanka won, the Cricket World Cup. I was doing the overnight stories for it.
Right.
And on the Today Show news, you'd have to keep everything really tight. And I'd written this package. It was like a minute, couple of wickets, couple of, 6. And then I got a call. So that was maybe the first run went out 6, and then at 6:30 I get a call in the edit suite from Kerry Packer saying, you missed this and you missed that incident, and there was a woman in a bikini that you should have put a shot in of her. And I said, okay. So then I go back to the EP and I said, I've got to run my package longer. He goes, you can't. I said, Kerry Packer himself. He goes, yeah, you can. So we ran this longer package that Kerry Packer had wanted. So
that's like a scene. How's that? That would have been terrifying.
It was.
Did you? What was the reaction? You picked up the phone and it's Kerry Packer. Did you go? I'm just
won't use the language. That was the. But I thought one night I'd bump into him because we used to have drinks on a Friday night up at the classic bar room that they had upstairs. That, I think it was built during the when Packer had first sold it. I think that they'd the Bond years that they built this thing. So on a Friday night, and I once went up there. I hadn't worked on the Friday, and I was living across the road with the deputy chief of staff, and so he rang and said, "Come up, Freddie." I didn't even get my foot in the door, and Paul Fenn goes, "What the F are you doing? You didn't work today. Piss off." And I just went, okay, and just walked back. You had to work on the Friday to drink on the Friday.
Got a different era to drink it.
Yeah.
What does life look now? A completely different. Wow. I mean, that is almost like not being rude. There's a lot of history in some of those stories. What does life look now? You're in New Zealand, and again, thank you for taking the time out of one of your not getting up at 4 o'clock mornings to have a chat to me. You've alluded to you're working. Most people would understand radio TV, but not everyone will understand Today FM. They'll think of Today FM and go whatever.
Like it's Aussie Today FM. Yeah, it's not great name.
Today FM in New Zealand. Different
format. It's a talkback news station. It's a news station that's been around for a year. We've got our anniversary coming up this week for the start of it. And I have to say it's the best culture I've ever worked for. Really good people. My boss, a guy called Gary Denver, lovely, like very, a quiet confidence about him. It's a great station to work for. The fact that it's called Today FM, a lot of Aussies that I speak to go, oh, you're working for, but it's a totally different brand. And then the company's called MediaWorks, so that's a big barn with all the different, they're not stations anymore, they're brands. And so they all just, there's a studio there and the next one's a studio and everything's done digitally. And I mean, it's exciting to get in early in the morning when all the breakfast teams are getting in and they're all kind of big personalities. And they see us in the newsroom as the adults. We're definitely the adults in the room. And, and the people that Grace, who's the morning sub-editor, she's young and she's so good at what she does. And then Hayley, who does the afternoons, this is great. And it's mainly, it would never have been like this. And we joke about this, Gary and I, who are kind of plus 50s in the newsroom there. The rest are young women. And we always say that this wouldn't have happened when I started in media. There's no way that you would have had that many women working there. So it just shows how, in terms of diversity and how everything's moved on, and which is a good thing because they're all really talented and good people, which is important.
I love the fact that New Zealand has so many brand stations. I loved living over there.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's awesome. There is whatever
blows your mind.
Yeah, whatever you're into, there's a station for it. And I think it's different because in Australia, you've got to buy a license and in New Zealand, it's a bit more open for the different niches. Yeah. I listen to the kind of 70s rock album station. My wife listens to the Doof Doof channel. So,
right. So hang on, you're a Hauraki man, and she's what's it called? The Rock. I don't know.
George. She's into George.
George FM. Yes.
George FM loves it. Yeah. So she owns the air in the car. So when we get in the car, it's only George, which drives me crazy. But then. My rock, my Led Zeppelin, Rolling Stone sensibilities drive her crazy. So.
Great, Mary. Compromise is always a good thing. Has your yes? Let's just go back to you starting out at Triple S. Then you get your big break on Capital. I will throw some of the old promos from Capital TV from the late 80s, early 90s in because they were some classics. Some of the old promos from back then are pretty cool. But has your career been as you'd hoped so far? Because you've worked in some real, and we'll come to this, you've worked in some really interesting roles. Now, people in Australia will know Craig from his time on Sky News. That's my kind of bad impersonation of you, but I did, you had that very senatorial Jim Whaley-esque approach in doing the sport on Sky, but you've worked in some really interesting jobs both in Australia and overseas. So has your career been what you thought it would be?
Yeah. I always, because I wrote it down before, like everyone I've worked for, if I went back in time and sat down with myself when I was 21 and said, this is it. This is I would have gone, oh my God, how good is that? From, let's say, the early days, Triple S to then Capital, then Nine. I worked at B Sky B in London in the sport department, and we won a BAFTA when I was there for working in their rugby department. And just travelling around doing rugby in Britain and Europe.
That would have been horrible.
Single Aussie, yeah, terrible. Then came back, worked for SBS, and got to work with Les Murray, and then Johnny Warren. Johnny Warren came to London Primary when I was in first grade. All I saw was the top of his head, and I still remember shaking. And then I used to work with him, and I told him the story. He loved that story. That he used to call me boss. Hey, boss, how are you? Then did SBS. Then I went to Sky News to work with the breadth of amazing people that Sky News had at the time when it started. It's moved a little bit different now, but back then when it had these legends of the industries to be working, there was never a day I didn't look around and think how lucky I was to be working alongside them. And then at the ABC, also working with these incredible broadcasters that I'd grown up with. Then I came here for a job on the racing board, but unfortunately, the week before I started, the CEO who hired me quit. So it was this kind of people. When I started, people were like, "No, you won't be here in a year." It was stressful, but we loved New Zealand so much we stayed. And then I went to Al Jazeera, which was an awesome experience to be in Doha, and then back to News Hub Media Works, then at Sky Sport when they used to have their Sky Sport News channel, which was a great experience. But unfortunately, COVID, then they got rid of it. And then to Media Works. So I would take that career that as the 21-year-old dreamer, I would have taken that career. But it looks like I'd planned it. When you look at it, it looks like, oh, yes, he planned all this. And I don't think many people in media plan their careers. They're just slogging away, trying to stay in the game, hoping that everyone needs a champion. Everyone needs. So everyone that I've opened doors for, if you look at when I was at Sky News alone, James Bracey, Yvonne Sampson, Mel McLaughlin, Ros Kelly, Sam Squires, Megan Barnard, Scott Jackson, who's still there, Luke Doherty, who's at Fox, Elise Dybell, who's now the deputy news chief at Sky News, Chris Rowe. Like, there were a lot of people that came through there that I hired. Everyone needs a champion. You know, Jim Patterson was an early champion of mine. You know, you need somebody who knocks down a door for you. If you don't have that person, which is why you should thank that person, because nobody's going to do it for you in life or in media. So I've been lucky enough to work with, and where I'm sitting here on the other side of the wall is memorabilia and things that I've had signed by famous people. And, you know, I've been really lucky with who I've met. But it's hard. It's a hard graft, and you can't make it through media without making a few enemies the way through, unintentionally, often. But I'll look back on it and I'll be thankful that I actually had a career like this, because it could have been like, I could have still been driving trucks for Swains. And I was lucky. At my 50th, a mate from uni gave a speech and said that I'm the only person that he knows who did what he wanted to do. Like, I wanted to be a journalist and I wanted to work in media, and I did. And I knew that from when I was a little boy. You know, it was always what I wanted to do.
That is brilliant. What I love is the complete commitment you had to getting in your Kingswood and driving all around New South Wales. I could almost, imagine with the window, wound down and a can of Coke or whatever, and you're like, right, off to Broken Hill, and the bloke
5-minute noodles and sleeping in the car and in caravan parks but and I was desperate to make it, but I just couldn't get the break. I couldn't get the break, and then when I did, I probably appreciated it more than most people. And I don't think people that I gave jobs to that did it much easier than I did. I hope they appreciate, that I opened the door for them.
What was some of your leadership? You've worked in some high profile roles, and we've talked a little bit about those. But what are some of the you've worked with some very high profile leaders in their own right, from Kerry Packer, all the way through. What are some of your leadership observations that you've taken away from your career so far in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly? So, good, bad, and indifferent leadership styles that you've seen.
I always tell young people coming through, if you want to be a manager or a leader, you've really got to want to do it, because it's hard, and you're trying to manage the individual and the group. So you'll have a target there in mind for the whole group. But particularly in media, the individual really is only caring about themselves. They don't care about the group. And I've had many people tell me, I don't care about the rest of them. Take care of me. So I think that's the hardest thing if you're a leader is finding a line between that, trying to satisfy and also satisfy yourself. Every job that I've worked in, I think I've grown as a leader and as a person through the attrition, through the really hard stuff. And you really only learn from your mistakes. So it's kind of make them fast. And I'd say that to young people who join. I said, go for it. Make mistakes, but don't make big ones, but don't do it again. Yeah. Just learn as you go. And that's a bit like anything else in life. And I think the best leaders that I've worked under, some fantastic from the Les Murrays. There was a guy called Jeremy Miller who was my boss, who was head of Metropolitan Radio at the ABC. I could wander up to his office. He would stop what he was doing and he would have a chat with me and he was so calm, and he was just such a nice, really talented manager. So, and because dealing with at the ABC some really big egos, he could explain, and he was dealing with bigger egos than I had to. And he was so calm with it. And even the Ian Cooks, where make a decision, it could be cranky at times, but move on. Whilst the worst bosses I've had were those fire and brimstone, explode out of their office or throw chairs at you and this kind of and that's how it was back then. But thankfully it's a bit different now. Gary, my current boss, the most effective bosses I've worked under would be a bit like being at war. You don't want a blunderbuss MacArthur or Patton. No. The guy you want is the guy who goes, right, here's the plan, and they're very clear with the plan, and here is who we're going to get to. And I'm sorry if sometimes I'm going to make a decision you're not going to like, but we're trying to get to here. And that has to do these days with the culture is important. Absolutely. You're not just trying to get ratings or whatever. You really have to balance the culture as well. And that's why the manager or the leader is so important. Sometimes they get it wrong. And they'll give people, this is unfortunately in media, they'll give people who are a bit too young a job before they're ready for it. You need a bit of mileage. And that's the toughest balance these days is culture and diversity. And you need people who are quite, have a broader understanding than the kind of managers I had when I first started. And the media has moved on. I just hope that they don't gut too many media places that will stop good young people coming through or quitting the industry because they think there's not enough money in it or there's not enough opportunities for creativity. That's the most difficult thing for managers these days is satisfying millennials and Generation Z who, in my day, we knew we had to serve our time. Now they want to have their own shows within a week, and they can get it on TikTok and then they start in a job and they think, well, why haven't I got that? Why haven't I got that here? Different industry. But I think as a leader, you only learn through every job because you get things wrong and you get a lot right, and then you can be satisfied with that. But nobody does a 100% job. And I don't know. I know what a bad leader looks like, but what a good leader looks like, the good leader is somebody who doesn't think they're the best leader. Ironically, because they're always trying to improve. Yeah. And I used to read when I was at the ABC. Every time I'd fly somewhere, I'd go to the bookstore and buy a book on leadership. And all those leadership books, it's common sense. But unless you're in the trenches, you won't know what leadership looks like or what adversity looks like until you're there. You can read 1,000 books, and I have. And the best ones tell it like it is. The worst ones say, but show some respect to some people. Yeah, you do all that stuff. And sometimes it doesn't work unless you're sitting there.
That's right.
And they're angry about something and they want something from you. You don't know unless you do it. The books, the YouTube stuff, it's clever, but unless you're doing it, you won't know.
Fair call. I totally agree. Yeah, that's as I look around, well, just to my right, there's a whole bunch of leadership books, and you go, okay.
Yeah.
They're not there when you're in the middle of it going, okay, I've got to deal with this person. So that's a really good point. In your time at the ABC here in Australia, you had to handle, and I don't want to go into the specifics because there's some of those things that are long history, but you had to handle some challenging media issues that focused on your own team. So without wanting to go into those, which are a matter of record and some historic time past, because it was a while ago. How did you handle some of those matters at the time? I mean, you're the head of ABC Grandstand, which is a very, very important part of Australian culture and Australian sporting life. What leadership go-tos did you have to go? I mean, you had to rely on yourself. You've got people like Jeremy Miller around you. How did you deal with some of those challenges?
I remember when I started bumping into Peter Fitzsimons, the author, former Wallaby columnist, and he's up here and I'm down here, and he put his arms around me and he said, you have the most historically significant job in Australian sport. Take care of it. Because they were like popes, like there'd been like three. Someone had to die and then someone took over as head of sport. And I was the first outsider that they hired to come in and it was mainly introducing, social media and digital and trying to. And there were a lot of older broadcasters who didn't want to get on board the social media train, and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and that was very hard. And at the same time, these were people that I grew up admiring and loving when I was listening to, and every decision I'd make. Somebody liked it and somebody didn't like it. And then, Peter Roebuck's, I'd never had to deal with someone dying on the job. And people listening to this can do a Google search on Peter Roebuck and see what happened. And there was a couple of, it was hard because if you got to ring 50 people and then I went into work and then there were people that I'd missed who fell through the cracks who just weren't in when I went in and I'd ring them and I couldn't get through to them, that made it hard. And then the ramifications from that. I think I got it 98% right, but it was just a couple of people I couldn't get to that. And that was hard, particularly with people. But my focus was on like Jim Maxwell or Drew Morford, Jeff Lawson, who were over there, and making sure that they were okay. But it's
because Peter,
we're learning.
For context for folks, that's right.
Yeah.
Peter died in South Africa. There was a test series that you folk were covering. The ABC was covering Australia South Africa test. Peter's died. You're in Sydney. They're in South Africa. Wow. Challenge.
And you can't, some people who didn't know him were mourning worse than those who were best friends with him. So I didn't quite understand that, and I'm not a psychologist or a counsellor. So I was simply trying to manage a situation and again, the individual, I'm trying to look after the group, but I'm trying at the same time take care of the individual. That was tough. And then the second incident was the Warren Ryan, David Morrow things. And, that was hard because the ABC has a very, very strong and powerful Indigenous board that I was having to answer to and trying to, I'm trying to defend my department, but at the same time, you can't defend racism. So, and I was never, ever going to try and find an excuse for doing that. And that's just the way it is. And that was really stressful because people were ringing me at work or sending lovely handwritten cursive letters to me telling me in a not very nice way that what a horrible piece of work I was and that they were legends. What would I know? Right? So this is what makes it hard. As I always say, if you want to be manager, you really got to want to do it. And it was interesting to see with the department because a lot of people stood by me and a lot of people stood back to wait to see who was going to win it. But again, wonderful support from ABC management, really strong people there. And also while I was there, we did negotiations for AFL, for rugby league, for cricket, for the Olympics. I was having to negotiate with outside businesses that own these rights. So that was an eye-opener as well because, I was first point of contact for negotiating and then you involved the rest of the ABC management. And we were protecting taxpayers' money. And unfortunately, near the end of my time there, in Cricket Australia and the AFL, these kind of big sports were trying to squeeze as much money out of the ABC. They decided they just wanted to monetize their sports. And the ABC was never going to have deep pockets. But they always imagined, as the staff did, that there was a magic pot of gold under my desk that I was hiding from them, which didn't exist. It didn't exist, and but again,
they didn't find it at Senate estimates.
No, I had to take that into mind, and again, you get back to the individual and the department. The individual didn't care about the Senate estimates and having to answer questions.
And I'm not being flippant.
No, because it was a real thing, and you've got to admire those ABC management because they cop it not only from internally from but also from Murdoch's press who just hammer them all the time, and but to work for an institution like the ABC, what an eye opener, and wow, you've got to admire the really good managers there because there's an art to it, and they put us on a lot of courses, and they put us through. There was an interesting. We did a course on leadership, and this is another thing that I'd learned. The one thing that I think I took out from working there was the word appreciate, and I would say this to any leader. There was a guy who was a former Mossad guy, Israeli guy, who came and gave a talk to the managers. And he dealt with kind of warring Middle Eastern states and trying to get them to understand each other. And he said, if you could sit across the table from someone and say to them, I appreciate your situation you're in. I appreciate how you went and spoke to these people and stopped that war. He said, that's the most powerful word in the English language. So I would say to any manager, any leader, if you could say you might be able to pay them the money they want, but if you can say to them, I appreciate, really at the end of the week, it's surprising the number of managers that don't do this. I really appreciate the hard work you put in this week. I really appreciate that you gave up your kid's soccer game to come in at short notice. I really appreciate, how hard you've been working. Not enough leaders do that. And I learned so much from that talk. And then the other one was, he said, do you know the name of your cleaner? And I didn't. And I remember I said to him, oh, what's your name? What is his name? And I wrote it on the thing. And so every night, because I'd be working back late, he would come in and I would say, oh, hey, how are you? And how are your kids? And it was just a little thing, but you could see it gave because he was invisible to everyone else. Invisible.
That's right.
Yeah. But I had to have it pointed out to me. And this is where experience comes into it. So unless you have that experience, you won't learn those. So Number one was appreciate, and number two was, do you know the name of your cleaner?
Wow. I love that. One of the things I listened to a podcast a couple of weeks ago from, and it's interesting you're talking about that, it was a principal who I knew in Canberra, a guy called David Mulford, and his take on that, which is very similar to yours, was his KPI for himself was knowing 5 things about all his staff and every kid in the school. So when he was at the rugby pitch with Craig Norenbergs at, was it Radford College back in the day, for example, I didn't go to Radford, but wherever, he would know that, so Dixon College, but he would know who dad and mum were, who the siblings were, that you loved, Melbourne Inga,
Yes.
and that he could come and have a conversation with you as equally he could the deputy principal. And I thought, gee, and I went away and reflected upon that, and I've only been in my job now 6 months. Do I know? And I actually said to the team straight after that conversation, do we all know, and we work across the country, do we know 5 real things about each other? And they went, oh. Good point. So
good point.
It goes back to your point about taking the time to make the time.
Yes.
So
know more about them. It's the little things that people will appreciate. And when I was at the ABC, I would try and ring around because they were all around Australia, and it was hard to. We do a fair bit of flying and trying to manage people when they're in Perth or they're in Wagga or somewhere like that, and you would end up spending more time with the squeaky wheels than the quiet ones. But then trying to remember, oh boy, I've got to ring up Bob this week, make sure that I'm, So that was the other challenge. It was a big team to manage, but they were also passionate about their jobs. You couldn't take away their passion, and they're passionate about their career, they're passionate about their jobs, passionate about their sports.
Yeah.
So a lot of the work was done for me in terms of professionalism and what they were doing. Their prep was awesome. It was mainly about satisfying their needs and making sure that they were moving forward.
Almost like having, dare I say it, a bunch of full forwards or halfbacks, depending on your team. Let's keep going. In 2016, after you'd moved to Auckland, and this is the joys of Google research, you're quoted in the New Zealand Herald saying it not only lived up to expectations, it's been better than we expected. Norenberg said his new Kiwi friends often joke he should be working for Tourism New Zealand because his review of living here is so positive. The people are so nice, the country is so beautiful. Okay, so I laughed at that because, as I've mentioned, and as I said to you before we came on to the show, I lived in Wellington for a couple of years. I still consider myself an honorary Wellingtonian, and my 9-year-old has got a bedroom not far away from where I am with full of Wellington Hurricanes gear and will not, for the love of money, support Melbourne Rebels. So no matter what I can do. So, Gus, you're not the only one who loves New Zealand. But my point is, how did you grapple with – so I love that quote because I just thought that is exactly what I said when I lived in New Zealand. It's a wonderful country. Tough being an Australian sports fan when you're living over there sometimes. But how did you grapple with the family moving over? How's it been? What's it been like being an expat in New Zealand, which they speak the same language, but they kind of really don't?
Yep. Haven't met many Aussies here. That's the one thing I've noticed. And that article, I think, there was a couple I did a cross with the Today Show, the Australian Today Show when I first moved. It was about the influx of Aussies moving to New Zealand, and I've hardly met any. But mainly then their interview was, even before the interview started, I could hear them doing sheep in my ear. So I took it seriously and they didn't. Right. So that I can still remember. I won't forgive them. And they spelt my name wrong in the super.
Oh.
Having worked for the Today Show years before, so disappointing. Anyway, it was a difficult start because I'd worked for the racing board and because the CEO had quit and they kind of the job had totally changed from being a creative job to effectively they were looking for an accountant and that wasn't me. So I knew the job wasn't for me. That was a bit stressful, but my son had to settle at school and we had to make new friends. We didn't know anyone. I knew one person, a guy called I knew Debbie Spillane had mentioned a guy called Trevor McEwen, who's a long time. He's a media legend in New Zealand, and he was the one guy I knew. So I'd had drinks with him, and so. But then you start to meet people, and so. But a pretty easy country to settle into. They're very wary of Australians. They've all run into that Australian on probably in Europe who's a bit noisy and Flight of the Conchords, if you look at some of your YouTube stuff, the way that they present Australians, that's kind of the experience that New Zealanders think, that they're loud Aussies in the corner, which I don't think I am. So made some great friends, and we're lucky where we live in Kohimarama, which is a beautiful part of the world. We've got a house, I don't know, 10 minutes walk from the beach, which you'd never get anywhere else.
No.
You wouldn't be able to afford it in Australia. So, and the people, like when I first started the racing board, if I had to sit people down and have a serious chat with them, they took it very well. They didn't like Aussies push back.
Right.
Oh, what? But they just would sit and go, oh, okay, then I'll try better next time. And they would. So I would say Aussies, there's a bit more pushback with Aussies in media than with Kiwis. And they a lot of them, and I've told a lot of the young ones, go to Australia. Go to Australia, and when you're young, and or go to Al Jazeera or try go to England. Because a lot of them, because it's a young group, particularly in media works, they're all very, oh, wow, I just want to do well here. And I'd say, look, when the time comes, spread your wings. New Zealanders are really, particularly with media, the media here is so sophisticated, and I think they sell themselves short that it's only little old New Zealand, but it's as good as anywhere else in the world. And the talent here is unbelievable, and that's why a lot of them leave. But again, I haven't. There used to be, first time when I was at MediaWorks, when it was MediaWorks News Hub, there was a guy who was in charge of the newsroom there who was Australian, and he never once asked me where I was from, which used to disappoint me. I'd bump into him, and I knew where he was from because I'd had but he never said, "And where are you from?" And I was waiting for the Canberra Raiders kind of Brumbies chat, but it never happened.
No,
which probably says something else. That gets back to that. Do you know the name of your cleaner? So I think, New Zealand, there's not much difference between the media. Only a thing I've noticed is Aussies are a bit more bolshy when it comes to this is who I am, whilst New Zealanders, they're kind of, which doesn't mean that the industry is any tougher, because it's probably even more competitive here because it's not as big and everyone knows everyone. But great talent. I've got to say it's as good as anywhere else in the world.
The thing, as an aside, the thing that strikes me as someone who does like to listen to stations in New Zealand and Australia and even around the other parts of the English-speaking world is Australia doesn't have two commercial talk stations or networks per se, as opposed to New Zealand and Radio New Zealand. And the thing that I also remember from my time over there was the amount of, and I know you've talked a little bit about this, we talked a little bit about George before, but the amount, you could pick, it was almost like pre-Spotify. I used to love Radio Hauraki or More FM when it was more local in Wellington, or The Breeze, which I know is under your umbrella. And, the amount of content that without being rude, like a population of that size pops out, and quality content night after night. News Hub on 3, which is only just hasn't been around forever, and then TVNZ, for example.
Great news services.
It's good stuff, and it's 7 nights a week popping out. It's not like we'll go to Sydney for the like they have with 10, for example. I'm not having a go at 10, not having a go at anyone, but unless we want to have a long conversation over a long beer about aggregation, but that's another conversation for another day. But the thing that strikes me, and I guess that's my question to you, is what's your media consumption like? I mean, you're up at all 4 o'clock. Are you able to switch off it in the afternoons when you're home with the family, or how does that work for you?
Yeah, I listen to... my wife and I do a lot of streaming in the evening of prestige television. I listen to a lot of podcasts, a lot of audio books on the way to work. Great. So it might take me, depending on traffic, half an hour. Used to take me, when I worked at the ABC, it would take me an hour or sometimes an hour and a half to drive in from the inner west where I was living into the city. So here, it's particularly at 3:30 in the morning when I'm driving to work, it's easier. So a lot of podcasts are great for catching up and getting some depth. So if we're going to do a story on Trump, then and whatever particular incident that week, let's say, so there is always a New York Times half-hour podcast that'll give you some more background. So because when I get into work, you normally hit the ground running. You've got to bang.
Right, so you've got to be on.
Straight into it, yeah. Because one of the other things, whenever, just near the end of Jacinta's, when she was PM, they sent me out a few times when she was in Auckland, and I'd get up real close. with the brand because I wanted to get the brand in shot with Jacinda. But the rest of the Kiwi media would all stand back. They would set up their microphones and be very respectful and stand back. But I would get right in the face, and I would do the same with Hipkins. Like you want to get right up front because that's how the Aussies do it.
That's right.
But I could feel them just burning a hole in the back of my head. Like, what are you doing? And to be fair, she was very polite because they'd ask their questions and I'd go, you'd have a question in mind. And then she would say, I know you haven't had a question. What have you got? So she was very fair when it came to that. So yeah, I don't know if Hipkins, it's the same. I haven't had the opportunity to do anything with him yet, but she was very nice. I was working the day that was the President, Prime Minister of Finland.
Oh, yes.
Was there, and then somebody had asked the question about whether they were, and I had the question after that. And thankfully, my question was on soft power in small nations, and it was an actual proper question. So and you could see the relief on Jacinda's face. She was like, finally, someone's asking a normal question, and that kind of great experiences doing that kind of thing.
When you're listening to TV or radio, are you able to turn off in terms of are you able to sit there and go, right, there is in the super, the graphic, whatever the graphic, there is 3 dot points of the highest scoring batters in that innings as opposed to 2, or are you able?
Yeah, there's a lot of
are you analysing it all? Yeah,
you do end up picking apart other news, and if I saw a spelling mistake go up on CNN on their super. And that's so rare at CNN. Yeah. We were all like, wow, look at that. So, you do pick apart. Because we always thought in newsrooms we're only doing the work for other stations to not pick us apart. Because my wife would see stuff and go, well, I didn't see it. I'd say, oh, look, there's a flash frame, or they got this wrong. Or my wife go, I didn't see it. Like, you're really only doing it for your own thing. But you can't escape. You've got to watch the 6 p.m. news. Because I go to bed quite early, so I've got to kind of watch that. I'm always listening to news bulletins on radio, ours and the opposition's, to try and, we monitor all day when we're at work what the opposition are doing. And we don't miss out on stories. So, it's harder now because newsrooms are smaller. You haven't got as many people to send out anymore, which isn't our fault. I remember I'd requested a story with someone, and they couldn't do it that day. They wanted to do it the next day. And I said, look, it was my one day off. And she was kind of accusing me of not, like Watergate, sleeping in the car. And it wasn't a story that warranted sleeping on my day off going to do it. But she didn't understand. She was like, well, you're a journalist, you should follow through for it. I think it was a question on the opening of a new bar or something. I thought, just that kind of, the assumption is people have seen all those movies, all the President's Men, where they're going, how do you get crusading journalists anymore when there's no money?
That's right.
To do that, So it's a much smaller industry. It's much tougher, and it's harder now for young people to come through to have a career like that. That's why they've got to broaden and they've got to go overseas and spread their wings.
That's a great segue into my next question. What's your advice to people who may think that their career should be linear or go to A to B to chief sports presenter?
Don't think it exists anymore. I don't think it used to be. You could get a job, maybe in Murdoch. They do it these days. You can start off at a regional News Limited newspaper, and if you stay within News Limited, you can effectively, well, at least you used to be able to become the CEO, but now they'll rather hire a lawyer or an accountant to be CEO rather than someone that's been in the trenches that understands the industry. So you end up just plugging away. But, in the end, as long as you keep working, you might have sometimes, like my career kind of I'd go there, I'd down a little bit more, but up, as long as you keep working, you're always going to pick something up from the job that you're in. And I can, so many times every time like Fox would go through redundancies and presenters would come and have a cup of coffee with me looking for new work, they only wanted to be a presenter. Oh, no, I don't, because I'd say, I'll get you some work in news radio, for example. Oh, no, I want to be can't you get me on the 6 p.m. news? I want to be the sport presenter in the 6 p.m. news. I'm like, I'm offering you a job. And you're being picky when you've just been sacked from your job. So, and that happens more often than you can imagine, that they particularly it's the lure of being a presenter. Say, well, hang on. I can remember being at SBS saying to work experience people, because I'd say, at the end of the week, what do you want to do? And they would just point into Les Murray's office and I want to do that. And I'd say, do you want to do what I do and start with nothing every day and build something every day and feel you've achieved every day?
Yeah.
Because you're going, I used to produce a show called Toyota World Sport at SBS. And every day I'd go home, I'd completed something, I'd achieved something and I'd got it done and then start the next day.
Yep.
But most of them would point to the corner office where Les was because they wanted to present like Les was. So my number one advice to people getting in, do not go the narrow presenting. If the presenting happens, that's great.
Yep.
And you can do both. When I was at Sky, I was presenting and I was producing, and when I was on my own, it was horrific. And I'd hate to actually go back and see how much, if any mistakes slipped through. And I probably was doing an exceptional job just keeping my wits about me at the time. So my number one advice is, and certainly do not sit in a job interview and say, when I say, now what would you like to do with your career? And say, I want to be a presenter. I used to hate that as the answer. I remember having an interview with the ABC. I didn't get it for a cadetship at the ABC when I was at ANU.
Yep.
And the manager of 702 back, not 702, 666 in Canberra
ABC,
said, what do you want to do? And I said, And I said to him when he said, what do you want to do? I said, I want one day. I said, not now, but I want your job. Not your job, but what you do. And he went, because he rarely he would hear people say, I want to be the main host or I want to be the, so even if you're lying, just say, I really want to be a producer. I just want to do whatever it takes because you've got to get your foot in the door, and you don't want to, these days you have to be multi-skilled.
Yep.
You just can't be a presenter. If the presenting happens, then it's nice.
We both have letters from the ABC saying, thank you very much for your application to be a cadet.
Typed.
I remember mine, and it's probably, I've got them all. I didn't get in the car, but I wrote to every radio station and newspaper in Victoria at the age of 18 after I'd finished high school, offered to go to work experience. So this is probably my this podcast is probably although I got a cadetship years ago later with Fairfax in Sydney, and for unknown reasons at the time working in Canberra in politics decided not to take it. And that was one of those, what didn't I do that moment for? But the passion that you must have and still have for the industry is just because you're on TikTok one day doesn't mean you're going to be on Channel 9 in Sydney or, TV3 New Zealand next. So let's talk about you a little bit more and about your sporting idols, because research is fantastic and you learn a lot about people. Where was that from? That was from one of the profiles about you, which talked about your sporting idols as soccer players Pele and Johnny Warren. We've had a little bit about Johnny Warren. Cricketers Doug Walters and Greg Chappell. Union legends Mark Ella and Cliff Morgan. And this is an interesting one. Your father, Eddie, for teaching you all about life's values and lessons that can be found in sport. So let's talk about Dad, because researching about you and sitting down on the laptop the other week and going, right, know a little bit about Craig from his time on TV. Then I came across this fascinating story about your dad and your family. So let's talk about Dad and the lessons that he's imparted, and then we might have a little bit of a wander back to Eastern Europe, if that's okay. So tell us about Eddie.
Dad was I'll just get my microphone right. Dad had immigrated to Australia from Latvia. He was actually born in the snow. My grandparents, with Dad's brother Ziggy, they were fleeing the Russians. So they were in Latvia, and Latvia was one of those countries that went from being independent to then the Germans came in and then the Russians came in. There was always like this arm wrestle. So they were escaping Latvia. They had to go Latvia, then through Germany to get to this displaced persons camp. So my grandmother was 9 months pregnant when she was doing it through the snow. They had to hide her in kind of wood piles sometimes when the Russian soldiers, because the Russian soldiers were just killing, they were animals, just killing and raping. And my poor pregnant grandmother was hidden in the wood pile so they couldn't see her. And so she gave birth to my father in the snow, which is just quite, just a nervous for a child to be born on the ice. And so, which affects him now because he didn't get, so my grandmother didn't have breast milk because she was starving. So Dad didn't have milk when he was a baby. So it's only now his spine's disintegrating because he didn't have the calcium back there. But they didn't write Australia on there when they got there.
That's right.
I think they'd written like Canada or USA and Argentina or something, Chile or something.
Yeah,
and
Canada,
so they
ended. It was Canada, USA, and Chile, but the authorities disagreed.
There you go.
And what did they do?
Yeah, and I think one of the uncles went to Chile and was never heard from again.
Wow.
So which was kind of like, it could have been us. So they just ended up in Australia. And he said he can still remember coming through and on the way they had fruit for the first time, like really fresh fruit. But then getting into, I think was it Melbourne that they stopped in first and being abused.
Oh.
Go home, you wogs, what are you doing here? And it was that kind of like, but our dad said he could just remember angry people yelling at him. They couldn't speak English. And then they settled in in a farm just outside of Queanbeyan in Canberra. And Dad, first day of school, wearing one of those kind of leather Germanic.
Oh,
can you imagine it? Yeah, lederhosen thing.
Yeah,
so
really
just
cool,
and having absolutely, being bullied and then, but they plugged away, and then it was pretty brutal upbringing, living on the farm, and then But I always think with my father that he's the kind of guy. He's a beautiful writer and he reads all the time, and it's quite artistic. But back in those days, people didn't have the opportunities to. He would have been a really good journalist. He would have been working in media, but he had a family to provide for, and I think he left school very young. The teacher basically said, Eddie, look, his real name's Ullis, but Eddie, you might as well leave school. What are you doing here? And so he went and pumped gas when he was 14 years old. Doing that kind of thing. So, but he inspires me, my father, because he's just a good man. He never missed a game of rugby that I played. Didn't matter during the week if he was out at the pub or whatever, or having dinner trying to get some clients. He never missed anything I did.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was growing up, I always appreciated that. And I always thought that, he had given me this love of radio, of love of writing, and a love of reading and everything. So everything that I've done, as I've said there, like I joke, he played rugby for the ACT when there were only 15 people in the ACT, but he, everything, sport, everything, it has come from him. So he's probably the biggest influence, along with Mum, because poor old Mum had to look after me. But in terms of influential for career, I think, it was my dad.
His piece about moving to Australia, which I found was really lovely, actually. He wrote very warmly and very lovingly, actually. So I thought...
and he always he's true. And this is the point about immigrants is, they love Australia because they want to live in Australia.
Yeah.
And particularly where they came from and having to kind of flee from both the Germans and the Russians. And they always appreciated Australia and what the Australians have given them and what's given me and his grandparents. And so, it's a feather in Australia's cap that all these people had come to this, because it's a bit like New Zealand. They're immigrant nations.
Yeah.
And that, we're so lucky. We're probably at the 0.001% of history of how lucky we are. There's probably about 15, 20 countries that you want to live in, and Australia and New Zealand are near the very top.
Absolutely. Have you ever gone back to, or not back to, but have you gone back, or have your parents gone back to Latvia?
Yeah, I've been. What
was that like?
I went to Riga and I went to Ventspils. I went to a couple of the places where the family are from. Right. The women were spectacularly beautiful,
right,
but icy, just not friendly. This was kind of maybe it was 10 years after communism had come down. All the guys kind of looked like me, so they were kind of. But the women were beautiful, but they were just very standoffish and cold. Like that, they, particularly if we're from Australia, you don't understand what it was like, and you're so lucky. And so I didn't find the people true, because all the Latvians I'd grown up around, they're having a party, the LP records, and just giving us hugs, and they were great, vodka and but. There, they were just still battling to come out of communism, but beautiful, stuck in the 1930s architecture and just beautiful.
Wow.
And a lot of it was snowing when we went there, and so I'd go for a run every morning, and a lot of homeless, people just kind of selling stuff on the street and still coming to terms with capitalism and communism. It was somewhere stuck between. I don't think Dad's been back. Like he's been to Germany and visited cousins and uncles there, but maybe one day one day I'll take him back, and it'd be nice to take him there.
What was it like growing up as a first generation in Canberra? Because, I mean, Queanbeyan, you know, across the border. Did you speak Latvian at home? And I don't want to.
Yeah, I went to Latvian school. They actually had
there you go.
So we go and learn, but I don't think my sister enjoyed it too much. So at some stage we got pulled out of it, but I can still remember I was quite good at it and picked up the language. So yeah, we didn't have much, like it was like Dad spoke Latvian around his mum because my grandfather had died years before, and so we were around a lot of Latvians. But at the same time, we had a really strong family in Queanbeyan, like big family in Queanbeyan. So I had the Aussie side of the family that was the kind of rugby league, going to Queanbeyan Blues and barbecues and beers. And then you had the Latvian side, which was, and both loved music, but the Latvian side was more vodka, brandy, singing songs. And we were always at a party with the Latvians. And so it was, it had a big influence because the Latvians were just good fun people. Now, they were really good fun. And I wish that I was old enough for a lot of them to sit them down and have chats with them about their lives and what they'd seen, you know, in Europe, and particularly with World War II, and what stories they would have had. But, you know, unfortunately, a lot of them, by the time I was probably in my 20s and I really wanted to embrace that, a lot of them had died and moved on. Tough story.
The story for your family, your grandparents, and I was trying to track kind of, that's a long way, you know, from Latvia through Eastern Germany and then to Germany to the western part of Germany, where they were in the Allied zone. What an incredible, you know, like wow to start with. But how courageous of them to go, we are going to try to do this, like so many other millions of displaced people at the end of the war were, and then to end up in Australia as opposed to whether there was a choice, Canada, US or Chile. It's just, you could have been commentating ice hockey in, you know, Toronto or something.
In Canada? Yeah, we could have.
In Canada.
I could have done it that way. And then at the same time, as much as I'd said, if Dad probably, as much as he loved Australia, and I think he would have loved if he'd had back then more avenues for a different career. Or, but you know, Canberra back then was a totally different place, and so was Queanbeyan. You know, so it's both. You know, the world's a much smaller place now with social media and satellite television and streaming, and you know, different world.
Think about your dream commentary team, your commentary dream team. If you've got a commentary box of 3 people, the sport's irrelevant, who would you have? You've worked with some fantastic sports broadcasters.
Wow. I've worked with so many amazing, and it's part of the looking back on their career and saying how lucky I've been with some of the amazing, I would say, I don't think necessarily he was the best commentator I worked with, but I became such good friends with him, and I really admired him. He had a similar story and background to my father, was Les Murray.
Great,
and he could call football, but sports irrelevant.
Yep.
You know, I'd like to have Johnny Warren there, because he was. I could still remember as a kid shaking when he came to my school, and it was Johnny Warren. But I also worked with some great, like Steve Mortimers and. We became very good friends when I was at Sky News with Steve, who sadly has dementia now. So, and Steve came to actually Les Murray came to my wedding, and people were like, "Oh my God!" And my wife's 40th, Steve Mortimer came to, and people were like, "Oh my God!" It's like to have these people that, or Mark Ella. I became really good friends with Mark Ella. So I'd probably have Les Murray just from. Because I got on very well with him. Johnny Warren just because when I was a young man, I couldn't believe that Johnny Warren came to my school. But there's endless, you know, people that I worked with the ABC that like there was never a time at the ABC I didn't sit with any of the commentators or the retired cricketers that we used and didn't think, wow. I think I'd have, and as the third person in the box, I'd have Debbie Spillane, who served as a great inspiration to me. I stalked her once as I joke with her because I've become very good friends with Debbie during I think it was the Barcelona Olympics when I was working at Triple S. I somehow got invited to the day at the AIS where they were showing around media ahead of the Olympics, and Debbie was there. And I was always a huge admirer of Debbie's, and because I know as a woman what she would have put up with, and well, she's written a book on it, so it's a great book too. And I just admired her, and I wanted to be like Debbie. And then so I followed her this day, and she seemed like a normal human being, but because she'd been in Sydney and she was my idol, so I'd put. Then I worked with Debbie at Grandstand, and that's one a big tick on my career. And then if I had to actually put in just some, if I had to have a host, there's a guy called Goran Paladin that I work with here, who is amongst the best broadcasters I've worked with anywhere in the world. He's a New Zealander. He could host the thing.
So thinking back on what we've discussed today, knowing what you now know today, what would 21-year-old Craig say to the Craig today? So he's sitting in Lynham at home with mum and dad. What would 21-year-old Craig say to the Craig of 2023?
He'd say, you put on some weight, which you just can't, it's like once you're over 50, it's impossible. I think he'd be pleased that if he knew what I was doing, if he was a 21-year-old sitting there, aside from the fact that he would think, oh, you're going grey. Because it would have all been physical when you're in your early 20s and you think you're bulletproof and you're young. And and I think I would have. And if this Craig had then said, well, what about, this is what I've done, then that Craig, 21, it would have looked at the list and gone, well done. Yeah. And then I would say, I can't tell you what adventures you're going to have, but, you'll travel the world. And that's all I wanted as a 21-year-old. So I think the 21-year-old Craig, most of the advice that would be giving me would be the way I dressed, or, when you're 21 and you think you think you know it all when you're 21 and,
Big wide world to conquer. And in a sentence and to finish, what would the Craig of 2023 say to the 21-year-old Craig?
I would say relax. I would say do not get in your Kingswood and drive and visit all the way, because nothing's going to come of it. Right. And the way that you break into the industry, literally the break that got me in the industry, none of that mattered. But and I'd say just relax. It's going to happen, and I try. And it's like anything in life now. You want it. It's going to happen, young man. I say that to people at work at the moment, just because they're like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. I said, you're doing what you're meant to be doing at that point. And everything I did, trying to get a break in the media and doing it tough, and then, driving trucks or working in cafes and bars, and you made a broad cross section of life. Live your life when you're 20s, and then you don't want to peak too early.
No, it'll work itself out.
No,
it will work itself out. Craig, thank you. That's been fantastic today. Congratulations on a wonderful career. You've come a long way, and a shout out to Capital TV, which really was back in the day. It was. I mean, you and I have been talking about it both during the show and before. It's regional TV, and I've got a soft spot for regional TV, having spent a bit of time up in Canberra and growing up in different parts of Victoria with grandparents. There
isn't as much of that anymore. A lot of people came through regional.
Yeah,
and it's a shame. I think it's the industry's loss.
Yeah,
a lot of very talented people, and a lot of very talented people I worked with. Most of them been lost to the industry, unfortunately, because it is a hard industry, and there's just not as many jobs anymore, which is sad. Because on social media, like you can have your own podcast now, and you can do your own TikTok stuff. Spoken like a 50-plus. They call it like at work. People call me a boomer at work. I'm not a boomer. I'm an X. I've got to tell them.
Yes.
X, not boomer.
Generation X, that's right.
Lump us all in the one. I used to, when I was at Canberra Uni, the couple I lived with were in a grunge band. You can't get more 90s than.
Oh, my Lord. In Canberra.
Canberra grunge band. It was called Scruff Lovely. They were fantastic people to live with. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. I never thought I'd get that answer. Thank you for joining us on Dear 21-Year-Old Me.
Thank you.
I really appreciated Craig's insights there about leadership, about some of the things that he's had to do, and about having to put the team first. It was interesting really listening to Craig in some of those difficult discussions he's had to have over his time, including at the ABC, and for reasons that he explained very eloquently. Not an easy conversation, some of those conversations to have, particularly when you're dealing with a matter many, many hours away in completely different continent and other country. Craig's had a really fascinating career. I really appreciated and respected the fact that he's gotten that, you can almost imagine it, driving out of Canberra and then through Western New South Wales to places like Broken Hill and that guy not turning up for the interview. That's a long drive and a very, very long drive back. So some fascinating insights there from a very experienced, humble and reflective journalist and manager in their own right. So thank you to Craig. All the links for the show will be up on the show notes. We'll obviously make sure that we do a shout out to Craig's colleagues on Today FM in New Zealand. Just as someone who lived in New Zealand there for a little while over those years back, amazing just how much content, and Craig and I reflected on it a little, how much content through TV New Zealand, TVNZ and then Radio New Zealand and News Talk ZB now today, radio station out of MediaWorks is just incredible. And I love living in New Zealand, and part of that was listening to stations like Hauraki and even a little bit of The Breeze in Wellington. Harbour City, you're a friend of mine, all those little jingles that come back in your mind. A great country, wonderful people, and I'm also not surprised that Craig has found it such a great country to live in. So wherever you are, New Zealand, Australia, the States, around the world, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Dear 21-Year-Old Me. A shout out, as always, to Darcy and the team for putting the podcast together in the background. But to you, most importantly, there are many, many things you could be doing with your day, and listening to this podcast is something that I really appreciate. So thank you very much for taking your time to listen to this podcast. That is it for this episode of Dear 21-Year-Old Me. Again, thanks to Craig Norenbergs, fantastic guest. Looking forward to catching up with Craig sometime. Hopefully I'll be able to buy him a beer or two when he's in Melbourne. And thank you to you for listening, no matter where you are. That's it. Go well. Stay well. Bye for now.
Thanks for joining us today. For more episodes and links, visit dear21yearoldme.com. And if you enjoyed the show, don't forget to rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts.